Good evening. My name is Claudia Karidis. I'm Vice President of Public Affairs at the American College of Greece. On behalf of the ACG administration and all my colleagues present here tonight, and there are quite a few of them, I would like to welcome you all to our campus. Dear Giles, it's a great pleasure to see you again, to have you back on our campus. Last time you were here, we were saying it was 2010, so it's a pleasure to see you again. Dr. Plumidi, it's a great pleasure to meet you today. I think this is your first time on campus. Okay, welcome. And we also want to warmly welcome our friends from Minos Publications Editions, and especially Yannis and Zoe Konstantaropoulou and the family and all the team from Minos, and to thank them for the collaboration for tonight's event. So we are very excited to jointly organize and present this event to present the latest edition of the book by Giles Mίλτον, Paradise Lost, which of course has references to our school and to some of the people that were the protagonists on the part of the school, unfortunately, at that time. Some very courageous administrators. The initial edition back in 2008 was actually the reason we then very soon collaborated in 2010, as I said, with Giles for another beautiful and relevant publication, The Story of Our School, which Giles supervised and also published. Tonight's event is co-organized, as I said, with Minos Editions and the ACG Institute for Hellenic Culture and the Liberal Arts. It is the first of the 3 public events that ACG will be hosting on the occasion of the 100-year anniversary of the Smyrna catastrophe. And there will be 2 more events much later in October and November. And all 3 big events go under the umbrella title, Remembering 1922, Commemorating the Asia Minor Catastrophe, Honoring ACG's Roots, because, as we know, 1922 also marked the complete destruction of our school that was then burned to the ground. It goes without saying that this is a very tragic anniversary and a very tragic event for all of us Greeks. But still, I would like to say that for us at ACG, it's also a reason to feel grateful. On this sad occasion, we are reminded once again of how some brave and visionary ACG administrators managed to overcome the hardships of 1922 and got the school to restart in Athens in 1923 at the invitation then of Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos. So we are also reminded of how so many more resourceful and dedicated ACG administrators and faculty members managed to overcome numerous other challenges throughout these 100 years until today. From destruction to forced migration to wars, dictatorship, financial crisis, and most recently the pandemic, our school's history goes in parallel with that of modern Greece. And as Giles had noted in the book he wrote for us, through no fault of its own, ACG came close to disaster on several occasions, yet it not only survived, but each time came out even stronger. So from Smyrna to Paleophalliro to Ellinikon to Agea Paraskevi, and just last month to the inauguration of our new kindergarten and elementary school in Sparta, ACG comprises today 3 divisions, 3 academic divisions, Peers, Diri, and Alba, spanning primary, secondary, and higher education, with a total of more 7,000 students studying with us, served by about 900 faculty, and with a strong network of more than 62,000 alumni who live over the globe. For us, this is a good reason to feel grateful as well as to feel proud, and I'm sure that the alumni in this room will feel the same way too, and I'm looking at some alumni. Professor Vlavianos, thank you for accepting to be the moderator for tonight's presentation and discussion. We all look forward to enjoying your interaction with the speakers and then with the audience. And before Dr. Vlavianos takes the floor, I would like to invite Mr. Yannis Konstantaropoulos to give his welcome remarks. Once again, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Mnimi, memory, memoir. Memory is an important part of who we are, with philosopher John Locke being one of the first to suggest that memory forms the foundation of our identity. And this idea makes sense. We shape our memory through stories of our life, of our surroundings, of our past, of our history. For that, we could certainly say that memory and history are linked. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, as Spanish philosopher George Santayana said, or as British statesman Winston Churchill wrote, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Therefore, the importance of historical book is so critical. Today we are delighted and honored to attend an extremely interesting discussion about a historical event that marked the collective memory of the Greek nation and global political scenery. In the sheer darkness of history, in the last century, one of its darkest episodes, the 1922 destruction of the Ottoman city of Smyrna, is nowadays often forgotten. Smyrna deserves to be remembered, if not as lost paradise, at least as a martyr to the human capacity for hate. R. Josh Horton wrote, when leaving the burning city, one of the keenest impressions which I brought with me from Smyrna was a feeling of shame that I belonged to the human race. In Paradise Lost, the prominent British journalist and author Giles Milton tells the story of Smyrna's fall in vivid and sometimes lurid terms. The Times described Milton as being able to take an event from history and make it to come alive, and I would add that one of our best-selling author and friend Giles can make historical events relevant to the public. Milton's narration unfolds through the memories of the survivors, many of them interviewed for the first time, and the eyewitness testimonies of those who found themselves caught up in one of the greatest catastrophes of the modern age. Paradise Lost is a tale of greed, brutality, and cynical realpolitik. It is also a story of extraordinary heroism. Paradise Lost is the book that everyone who wants to know what really happened in Smyrna in 1922 should read. 2022 is a year of remembrance of the Asia Minor catastrophe, but also it is significant for Minoa's edition because it marks 70 years from its establishment. Since 1952, Minoa's edition offers to readers high-quality books that, among other things, keep historical memories alive. Finally, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. David Horner, President of the American College of Greece, and Ms. Claudia Karidis, Vice President of Public Affairs, for co-organizing with Minoas this event. Also, I would like to thank, for their precious contributions, Dr. Spyrίδων Plumidis and Dr. Χάρης Βλαβιανός, both history professors and authors. Thank you very much.
Good evening to all of you. We are today to have Giles Mίλton with us, and we decided that in order to make the event more lively, instead of actually having both Giles and Professor Plumidis read papers, we're going to have a discussion. I'm going to raise some questions, and in that way, hopefully you won't get bored. Actually, you'll be more excited at the end. Well, as the publisher of Mino's publication said, the centenary of the Asia Minor catastrophe of 1922 deserves more than a somber tribute to one of the most traumatic moments of our collective history. It presents us with the opportunity to consider the power of memory in the aftermath of uprooting and disaster, and to honor the ordinary people, by the way, like my grandmother, who was a Smyrnia, who took it upon themselves to become guardians of lost homelands by painstakingly preserving salvaged documents and objects, remnants of material culture and musical and cultural traditions. Actually, exactly the kind of things that Giles investigated and researched when he was writing his book. And all that constituted the only lingering ties binding the survivors to a world that was no more. George Orwell, to quote somebody else, famously stated that those who control the past control the future, and those who control the present control the past, words which ring particularly true in today's paradoxical digital world, where the dissemination of information has never been broader or faster, but where our ability to discern the truth has never been more at stake. Therein perhaps lies the deeper importance of an event such as this, which acknowledges the persistence of memory by going back to records, testimonials, words, and images, back to the bitter truth of human experience, preserving elements of people's lives and their histories, recording their journey from tragedy and loss to rebirth and hope, pointing to the power of memory in shaping our collective self-perception as we look to the future, as in that invaluable link which enables a nation to maintain its sense of self in an increasingly global world. Now, Giles is, as you all know, an internationally best-selling author of 12 works of narrative history, if I'm correct. His books have been translated into more than 25 languages, including Greek, have been serialized on both the BBC and the British newspapers, and he's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Giles and myself also have something in common. As I told him when we had coffee, we both did our undergraduate degree at Bristol University, and we both have very fond memories of that university. He was born, he's younger than me, he was born in '66. He was educated at Latimer Upper School, and then, as I said, he went to the University of Bristol where he read English. He's written a number of non-fiction books, as well as he's written 3 novels as well. But today we're here to discuss his book on Smyrna. The title is Paradise Lost. Obviously, with that surname that he has, he couldn't actually chosen another title. I mean, Milton, Paradise Lost. Probably some people actually bought the book because they thought they were going to read a poem, but they wrote about Smyrna. They went out of the bookshop and they opened the book and they realized it wasn't actually poetry. So Paradise Lost, Smyrna, 1922 is Milton's 6th work of narrative history, is of course a graphic account of the bloody sacking of Smyrna in September 1922, and the subsequent expulsion of 1,300,000 Oxford Greeks from Turkey and about 150,000 Muslims from Greece. And this is recounted in a wonderful way in the book through the eyes and the testimony of the Levantine community. The book, of course, was widely reviewed abroad and here in Greece. And, the book is about the story of, and Giles will have a chance we're going to discuss that, but, it's the destruction of the second biggest city in the Ottoman Turkey, and the subsequent exodus of all these Greeks from Anatolia. And this exodus is told through the accounts of those who were there, he's making use of unpublished diaries, letters written by Smyrna's Levantine elite. And I think this is the way, through their voices, that he actually, made this book. And this book, I think, is extremely important because it's a very well research account of what actually happened there. And so I'm not going to say more about the book because I would like him to talk about the book. And my other guest here today is Spyrίδων Plumidis. He's an associate professor of modern Greek history at the National Kapodistria University of Athens. He also teaches the Hellenic Open University. He read history at the Ionian University in Corfu. He has a doctorate from the University of London. He has published numerous books on nationalism, ethnic rivalry in the Balkans, particularly between Greece and Bulgaria. He also written on General Metaxas' dictatorship, but also on the Asia Minor question, which concerns us here tonight. So I'm going to sit now and we start the debate. Okay. The first question I would like to ask Giles is to give us an account of what was Smyrna like, just before the catastrophe. What was Smyrna like in the years preceding all this dramatic, event?
Right. Well, I will do exactly that. I'm just going to frame it very briefly by saying that if you read a Greek account of what happened to Smyrna in September 1922, you get one story. If you read a Turkish account, you get a completely different story. So what I wanted to do and focus on in this book was to look at the Levantine community, which was very little known and very little studied. Who were the Levantines? They were Europeans of British, French, Italian descent, who some 200 years before the catastrophe had moved into the city, and they'd amassed spectacular fortunes. I mean, they controlled the industry in figs and sultanas, for which the city was very famous, insurance, shipping, banking. They were immensely powerful, wealthy dynasties, and they'd built themselves charmed lives. They lived in the suburbs outside, just outside the city centre, notably Bornabat, as it was then called. And they built these huge palatial residences, botanical gardens. And this was first what drew me into the city, this what seemed to be a charmed city. Because Smyrna in this period was rich, it was cosmopolitan, it was tolerant, it was open-minded. It seemed to be built on the image of these Levantine families. And so if, you know, in the early years of the 20th century, you went for a walk along the promenade, the famous promenade of Smyrna, you'd hear every language under the sun. There'd be bars, there'd be brasseries, there'd be European-style hotels, every sort of music from honky-tonk to Greek orchestras playing. It was an incredible melting pot of cultures, of ethnicities, and so I went in search of these records. Now, it's not easy to find an archive when the archive doesn't exist. So I had to try to track down these families, of whom almost none are left in the present city of Izmir. I found a very elderly lady in London called Miss Whittle. And Miss Whittle, she was from the famous Whittle dynasty, one of the most powerful of all the Levantine families. And she sort of provided me access to the various descendants of the various dynasties that had lived there. And little by little, I got invited into their homes and discovered that they had a treasure trove of letters, of diaries, of handwritten accounts, all of which were detailed eyewitness accounts of exactly what took place in September 1922. And it should be said, because this is very important in the telling of the story in my book, is that the Levantines didn't particularly care who ran Smyrna, whether it was Greeks or Turks. What they wanted was to continue to make vast sums of money. And so they, and also I have to say the Americans, whose accounts I also relied on for this retelling of this story, they, to me, seem to be the most reliable eyewitness accounts of everything that took place. They're often harrowing, they make very difficult reading, but they are very powerful, and they became really the framework through which I told this story.
What you're saying, actually, the city itself was not that very typical Ottoman city. You're describing something very different. So probably, how did the Turks actually feel in that cosmopolitan environment, which was mostly Christian?
Yeah, this is a very important point to make. Smyrna was known as Infidel Smyrna. It had a majority Christian, a big majority Christian population. There were about 350,000 Greeks in this period living in the city, and about 170,000 Turks. There were Americans, there were Europeans, there were a Jewish community, there was a large Armenian community, and an American community as well. Incidentally, you mentioned the title of my book, Paradise Lost, and yes, of course, it was a sort of whimsical pleasure to me to call it Paradise Lost, but it's not entirely gratuitous, I have to say. When the Americans first arrived in Smyrna, this city in Asia Minor, they were absolutely astonished to find themselves living in a city that was far more open-minded and tolerant than most of the cities back at home. And so when they established their district of the city, because all the nationalities tended to live in separate districts, they called their district Paradise because they felt they'd landed in paradise. So this city was a city that had always looked west. The famous quayside, of course, is looking out westwards, and it was a city that looked west. It did its business with the West, and it was a complete anomaly of all the cities in Asia Minor. And this, of course, made the job of the Ottoman governor extremely difficult. He was always a Turk, But he found himself with this city that did not always agree with what was taking place in the Ottoman capital. And indeed, this would become a huge problem in the First World War when Smyrna simply did not agree with what was going on in Constantinople.
Thank you very much. And now that actually gives me the chance to ask Spiros a question that goes a little bit before the actual catastrophe. We know that the Turkish government, the Neo-Turks, the Neo-Turkey, because Turkey lost, the Ottoman Empire lost in the Balkan Wars, they began actually straight after the Balkan Wars a policy of extermination of the Greeks. Did in Venizelos' mind the idea mature at that point that, I mean, he joined the right side in World War I, so he joined the victorious side, but the idea that the Greeks had to go to Smyrna to establish a base there, to safeguard the Greek population of Asia Minor. Did that idea actually come to him, apart from the Megali idea generally, but here we had an event, the extermination of Greeks by the Neo-Turks. Is that connected, I mean, with what happened later?
Yeah, that's correct. Greece's involvement in Asia Minor has actually been overshadowed by the events of the First World War. The Greek story of Asia Minor did not start in 1919 when the Greek army landed in the Ke, in the waterfront of Smyrna, but back in 1914. The main reason behind Greece's Asia Minor campaign and the impulse behind Greece's Asia Minor agenda was not a great idea. It was an anti-Greek pogrom that went out of hand there in Western Asia Minor back in 1914, actually in time of peace. In early 1914, a series of atrocities started happening against the Greek Orthodox. Firstly, in the village of Andrianople, that is in Turkish Thrace, and very shortly they spilled over into the village of Smyrna and Bursa, that is Western Asia Minor. These ghastly atrocities, this violence, amounted to what we will call today ethnic cleansing. It entailed intimidation, boycotting, pillaging, starvation, rapes, firing at civilians, and random murders. As a result of all of this, the islands of Chios and Mytilene, as well as Salonika, were literally flooded with 200,000 Greek Orthodox, meaning ethnic Greeks, as refugees, according to present-day estimates, scholarly estimates. Present-day scholars, Scandinavian scholars, describe this ethnic cleansing of Aegean Greeks as a case of violent Turkification aimed at the homogenization of the Ottoman Empire, and they place it within the framework of late Ottoman genocides. The most well-documented case was the destruction of old Phocia, Phocae Adenitas, they called it back then. We have a written testimony presented by a French archaeologist, Félix Sartiot, who happened to be there that fateful summer of 1914. Sartiot witnessed these deplorable events and also photographed them, and left us behind hard material that testifies to this anti-Greek pogrom. In 2008, an album with 200 photos of Félix Sartiot appeared, both in Greek and in French, and we have openly to everybody available this material. So yes, the story of Asia Minor starts 8 years earlier than we usually think.
I forgot to say that we also have another distinguished author in the audience, Bruce Clark, hello, who's also written on Asia Minor, and he just informed me something that I should have known, that he wrote a book which will be published in Greek called Athens, the City of Wisdom. Athena, πόλη της Σοφίας. So it's a biography of Athens.
And Bruce's book, Twice a Stranger, is
Twice a Stranger
wonderful.
About Asia Minor. Yeah. Okay. Very happy to have you with us. Okay. So basically, the whole adventure begins before. The question was that we'd like to ask Giles is. You spoke about this city of Smyrna, and obviously it was run by a Turk, but the Turkish population of Smyrna was minority and probably class-wise was not so well off. So there was, as you said, it was always infidel Izmir. Turkish historians actually see the landing of the army in May 1919, and the subsequent kind of military advance, as basically an imperialist war from the Turkish side. What's your view on that?
I mean, it's interesting to look very closely at the landing of the Greek troops because it was a lot of what happened subsequently is due to what happened on that day when they landed. Of course, in Smyrna itself, there was huge excitement at the idea that Greeks were coming to land in the city. And although there was meant to, they called the city authorities had called for calm and everything, of course, when the troops landed, thousands of Greeks turned out with Greek flags, and there were bands playing, and it was an incredibly colourful spectacle. And rather than the Greek troops who were meant to seal off various sections of the city to make sure there was no trouble or anything, they performed essentially a victory parade on the quayside. They were also Metropolitan Chrysostom, the most senior religious figure in Smyrna, came down to bless the newly landed soldiers as well. Now, in a few hours before this had happened, the Turkish protests had begun, and they'd begun on a very big scale. And there were all sorts of accounts of the armory of the city being broken open, of weapons being handed round. And you can imagine this is a tinderbox. This is a disaster waiting to happen. And sure enough, it was very soon after the Greeks had landed that a shot rings out. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it was a signal for an almighty gun battle, basically. And with unbelievable bloodshed. And we still have no idea how many people were killed. Possibly 150, 200 Turks were killed. Some dozens of Greeks were killed as well at the time. So this is how the Greek occupation got started. It was a disaster really from the very beginning. And Venizelos really had to act very quickly to try and bring some sort of control, some sort of order before everything spilled totally out of control.
And what in this context, what was the role of Steriadis? You think he did a good job? Because, I mean, he was Greek, so would he be trusted by the Turks?
Well, his role is very interesting because I believe he doesn't get still to this day, he doesn't get a terribly good press in Greece. But I feel from everything I read that he was incredibly even-handed. He was, in fact, a professor of Muslim law, actually, I think I'm right in saying. And he was determined to bring law and order to the city. And if that meant punishing Greeks who had committed atrocities, then they were going to be punished. And indeed they were. And this really earned him, I think, he was never a popular figure among the local population, but of course he didn't win the support of the Turkish population either. I think the damage was already done on day one of the landing of the Greek troops.
I turn to Professor Plumidis. One thing that is always very central to the Asia Minor story is this ominous elections of 1920, which Venizelos lost. And then after that, the whole picture changed. The royalists came in power, and the allies, especially the French and the Italians, found a wonderful alibi to drop the Greeks. My question is, why did Venizelos hold the elections in 1920? Why didn't he continue the war without elections? Why did he lose them also? And did he expect or even wish for that loss? Because by that 1920, as Charles said, the picture wasn't very rosy on that front.
There is a big misunderstanding here and misinterpretation of the whole story. Venizelos was power thirsty. He never wished to get part with power. So this is out of the question whether he wanted to win the elections or lose them. Venizelos called elections in September 1920 because the war officially was over. The peace treaty was already signed. in Paris the month before, and he was pretty sure that he was going to win the elections, and with a score. So in his mind, there was no doubt that he was going to lose the elections. By far, this is wrong. So
I agree with you, but can you give us reasons why you think he lost the election? Because he was obviously the elections were after the Treaty of the Sèvres, where Greece became enlarged and very successful. So why did he lose the elections?
Actually, as I point in my book on Venizelos, published in 2020, Venizelos had started losing influence within the Greek public in August 1916, and a proof of this is the mass movement of the reservists that swayed in the country in the summer of 1916. Anyway, the main reason why Venizelos lost the elections on the 1st of November 1920 is the glory of King Constantine that overshadowed the glory of victory, of war victory. King Constantine was used by Venizelos' opponent as a flag in the elections, and it proved to be an all-powerful weapon.
What you mean is that despite the great schism, despite the fact that Venizelos sided with the victors, nevertheless, the royalists enjoyed the residual support in Greece that Venizelos underestimated.
The result of the 1920 elections proved that in 1920 Greeks were in their majority monarchists.
And can I just add a quote, because it's an interesting quote from Winston Churchill, who, of course, Constantine was reviled in Great Britain and in France. And in France, of course, yeah. Winston Churchill said, and just it's always good to quote Winston Churchill, he said, "The return of King Constantine dissolved all allied loyalties to Greece, just at the moment when her needs were greatest and her commitments were becoming most embarrassing to herself and others, she had, of her own free will, sponged the slate."
But turning to Professor Plumidis, was this commitment so strong, as people assume, or wasn't that big? And the return of the king gave, as I said, a useful alibi for the great powers to gradually distance themselves. And we know that the French and the Italians actually began to sign deals with Kemal behind the backs of the Greeks. What would you say on that?
Before the fall of Venizelos from power, the three powers, meaning the Adan powers, were committed to Greece politically, diplomatically, and financially. But this commitment had a personal character. The three powers were mostly bound to the persona of Venizelos. After his fall and his exile from Greece, they felt free to follow a different policy, to disengage themselves from Greece and to turn their back fully to Greece. Greece was no longer considered as part of this alliance, was no longer an ally of the French, the British, and the Italians. They stopped all financial credit to Greece, and they declared strict neutrality towards the two belligerents, meaning Greece and Turkey. So it was a watershed. The elections of 1920 was a watershed in the history of Asia Minor.
Did they actually follow the policy of strict neutrality? They were selling weapons to Kemal behind the backs of the Greeks.
Well, in the course of the next 2 years, they swayed with towards Kemal, yes, and the Turkish nationalists, and they gave material and diplomatic support to the Kemalists.
One of the most, I'm trying to find the word now, horrifying chapters in the book is what actually happened the day when Smyrna began to burn, and you had all the Allied ships anchored, and you had all the population, all the Greeks actually, and a lot of Levantines coming to the to the seafront, and the actual the fleets of the powers keeping a kind of neutral position. That must be really horrific.
I mean, yeah, it's worth painting the scene about how it was like at the time. So, in fact, I found the diary of a very elderly Levantine woman called Hortense Woods, who lived on the outskirts of the city, on the road through which the Turkish army was going to come into the city. And her diary provided a graphic account of the arrival. Well, first of all, the arrival of the vanquished Greek army, and then the arrival of the victorious Turks. So this is sort of one of the eyewitness accounts I used. But you're right to say, and it's important to stress, that as the disaster unfolded, and as tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of desperate, homeless refugees carrying, their young children and pretty much very little else, as they congregated on the quayside of Smyrna, because they had nowhere else to go, there were 21 Allied battleships in the Bay of Smyrna, including a large number of British ones and 3 big American battleships. What are they going to do over the next few days? They're going to do precisely nothing. They are not going to help pull off these desperate refugees from the quayside. They're not going to intervene at all. And I think the reason for this is because they realize who's won this war. They are already eyeing up the rich trade deals they're hoping to do with Mustafa Kemal. And so they're under orders from London and Washington to do precisely nothing. And that is how this disaster is going to unfold for the first week. And then, of course, we have the fire of Smyrna, and this is one of the most controversial episodes of all. And I just wanted to one very interesting document I found when I was writing the book on the American College of Greece, the history of it, in the archives, which had lain unknown here for decades. I found a long account written by Miss Minnie Mills, who worked for the original school in Smyrna. This is not the one that's been quoted. This is a much longer one. And I'll just read you 2 extracts, because this and many others all tell a very, very similar story. She says, "I saw a Turkish officer in uniform coming out of a house, taking with him tin containers full of petrol, which were situated on the exterior staircase of another house. He took one of them, he entered a 3rd house, and then having returned, he took more tin containers. He entered a 4th house, and so on and so forth. A few minutes later, these houses were successively ablaze, and in a short while, the whole street was on fire." She says, "We had been surrounded by flames, and after the refusal of the Turkish firemen, we attempted to improvise our defense against the fire. Our servants climbed on the roof, they sprayed the water on the walls. Then the soldiers who surrounded us threatened shooting the servants if they didn't stop spraying the water. And we realized then that the burning down of the school had been pre-decided." So that's one account by one American, I think a very reliable eyewitness. But as I say, I collected countless others from Americans and from Levantines who were there, all describing very similar scenes, which suggested that the fire was willingly and deliberately started by the regular Turkish army.
Okay, so that refutes the story that some Turkish historians put forward, that the fire started by some Armenians trying to burn the Turkish side.
Yeah, so I was most surprised when this book came out, and a Turkish publisher came forward and said he wanted to publish a Turkish edition. And he said, "I profoundly disagree with what you wrote in this book, but being an enlightened chap, he said, I think it should be available to a Turkish audience. They should be able to read it and make up their own minds." He fervently believed, although I have to say without any evidence whatsoever, that the Armenians set fire to the city, which seems to me one of the more preposterous theories that have been advanced.
I'll turn to Professor Plumidis again. Why did Venizelos demand Smyrna for Greece at the Paris Peace Conference and not Constantinople?
Good question. For 2 reasons. Firstly, because that he was persuaded that eventually Constantinople will fall into Greece's hands as a ripe fruit at the end of the war or shortly after the war, because Constantinople was surrounded by Greek troops, both in the European and the Asian part of Turkey. And secondly, because the Constantinople Greek Orthodox communities were not in danger back then. who was in danger of extinction? It was the Asia Minor Greeks. Those needed to be protected and saved from extinction. So Venizelos aimed at serving an urgent agenda and left the agenda of Constantinople for later. Certainly, you can blame the successors of Venizelos for the Asia Minor disaster. They can definitely be historically and politically held responsible for this serious defeat. Nevertheless, the Asia Minor campaign was a very difficult campaign, but it was not doomed from the beginning. If Greece had pushed its army fastly towards Ankara back in the spring of 1920, it had more chances to defeat the Kemalist army before it regrouped and before Kemal created a political structure in Ankara. The campaign towards Ankara was a necessity. I mean, you can't hold Smyrna without a hinterland and without a strong defensive line further in the peninsula, the Asia Minor peninsula.
Overstretched 200 miles from Smyrna to Ankara? It's 200 miles. They got 40 miles out of the city. Wasn't that army overstretched and thinly, kind of a very thin line, and then Kemal could attack any point and break the Greek army?
This was all inevitable. I mean, Greece had to do a very big effort to save the fellow Greeks of Asia Minor, meaning Asiatic Turkey.
Well, I think that the Greek lines were hugely overstretched, and I mean, we're seeing in the war now in Ukraine that you can disrupt a highly mechanized army relatively easy with beautifully targeted acts of sabotage. And I think that what happened to the Greek army is that its lines were overstretched, and Mustafa Kemal chose to attack the supply lines, so not only was the Greek army not getting munitions at the front line, but it was not getting food or water either. And I think it had simply gone too far without the support it needed.
Can I also address the same question to you about the execution of the six? Do you think it was, because I mean, when you accuse a prime minister and ex-prime ministers in general of high treason, that means that they actually did something on purpose to damage their country. So they didn't do it on purpose. I mean, whatever omissions or mistakes they made. So do you think that this was a kind of judicial murder to actually execute those six?
I find that a very difficult one to answer. Yeah.
I'm saying that because the execution of the six created a kind of blood feud between the royals and the Venizelos, and that kind of blood feud went on, through the interwar period leading up to the Metaxas dictatorship. So, it wasn't the period that followed the Asia Minor catastrophe wasn't, a period of calm. I mean, it was a turbulent period that ended up with a dictatorship a few years later. So that's what I'm asking.
I mean, I think, by late 1921, whatever the situation, the Greek army was doomed. It was inevitably, it was riven by political division, but it was inevitable. The defeat was inevitable, I think. You disagree?
That's why we have a debate here. That's the point of the whole presentation. Would you like to comment on that? Do you think that it was enough?
If you don't try, you don't get. I mean, you can't say I'm not getting out of bed in the morning because something might happen to me. I might slip and fall and hit my head and die. Greece had a duty to save these people, a moral and political duty. If Greece had not campaigned in Asia Minor, Venizelos would have been identified today as the biggest traitor the Greek history ever acknowledged. So Greece played and lost, but at least played and left Asia Minor with honor. And that, I'm sorry to say, did not happen a few decades later in 1974 when Cyprus was left to be run over by the Turks without any help from Greece. So you can't blame somebody for their faults. You can blame them for their bad intentions or negligence or mismanagement. And definitely the 6 politicians sentenced to death were bad managers, but they were not traitors. Neither was Venizelos. Yeah, it was a very harsh penalty. I mean,
It was a hard penalty.
yes, yes.
But do you think the Greek army could have saved itself even as late as 1921, late 1921?
Definitely, if the morale was managed better. According to Greek war information, there was a balance of power still in Asia Minor in mid-1922. So Greeks would have held the line and stopped Turkey there. And today's story, the relations between Greece and Turkey, will be a very different story.
But wouldn't have been a bit strange, I mean, geographically speaking, even if the Greeks had been victorious, to have Smyrna in the hinterland, a little piece there in a whole country called Turkey? Wouldn't have been that a bit strange? You know, just a little enclave to be Greek, surrounded by Turks. Wouldn't have been that strange, geographically speaking.
Well, that's my point. I mean, if you read into my book published in 2016, the first person who indicated this line as a defensive line, both geostrategically and physically and all that, was Ioannis Metaxas. In one of his memorandums, one of the 3 memorandums that he submitted to Eleftherios Venizelos, claimed that if that campaign was going to happen against his personal wishes and advice, the best line of defense was the Kyutahia Skis-Ehirant Afyon line. So
it's interesting you mentioned that, because that would be my next question. Metaxas, although we associate Metaxas with a dictatorship as a dictator, nevertheless he was a good strategist. His view was that this campaign was doomed. And his prophecy came true in a way. So you're saying that it was a question of morale, but what kind of morale you can have when the whole country is divided from 1915, when you have the Great Schism, when Venizelos has lost the election, left Greece, the royalists come back, and obviously there are penalties against the Venizelos. What kind of morale can you have in an army when the whole country is divided into 2 blocks?
The Greeks, the Greek warriors, not lose their morale because of national schism, but because they lost faith in a final victory. The same happened with the Germans in the First World War. The German Western Front and Balkan Front melted because they didn't see any hope. So if the post-Venizelist leadership of our country had boosted the morale and kept them fast in hope and faith in the final victory, the story today will be totally different. There wouldn't be...
How would the Germans keep their morale up when you have 1 million American soldiers landing in Europe in June of 1918? That would have been quite impossible for the Germans high command to keep their morale on with 1 million American soldiers landing in Europe. They could have kept their morale if they won the year before, but they hadn't, so the last thing in the Western Front went bad. Then the Americans arrived and the story is finished. What I'm trying to say about the morale is the change of generals at the last minute. Khadzanestis, a man who hadn't fought since the Balkan Wars, he arrives and takes command of the army. Can you keep morale up with these kind of changes in the army all the time? I don't know. What do you think?
I just wanted to go back to the point about the demographics of the population and where the frontier should be. There was an extraordinary episode in Paris when Venizelos came to Paris and he launched a charm offensive, which was extremely effective, talking of his holidays in Greece and in Asia Minor and bringing postcards of Greek fishermen in these villages of Asia Minor. And he just charmed British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who was prepared, I think, to grant Venizelos pretty much everything he wanted. And there was one extraordinary episode told by the British diplomat Harold Nicholson, who recounts that Lloyd George and Venizelos were hunched over a map of Asia Minor. And Lloyd George turned to Venizelos, said, well, you can have these bits here, this one, this one, this one, this one, all of these bits, because they're green. He thought he was looking at a demographic map of Asia Minor. In fact, it was a topographical map, and these were forests that he was giving away. So the level of sort of amateurishness that was taking place really shocked me when it came to dividing up the spoils of war.
On the question I asked Professor Plumidis, what do you think about would that, even if we actually had that place, let's say that we had the referendum in 1925 and the Greeks actually won the case, to actually have that enclave in a huge Turkish country?
I think this was a massive problem from the very beginning. I mean, yes, you have a majority Greek city, the city of Smyrna, although there are huge population, other ethnic groups living in the city as well. You know, as I said, 170,000 Turks living in the city. But once you get beyond the sort of frontier of the city, the outskirts of the city, you're certainly not into majority Greek territory. And I think this was a fundamental problem all the way along. And once the Greek army moves out a little bit to protect the city and it gets attacked, it has to move out a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And within a few months, it finds itself halfway across Asia Minor.
Although I think I agree with you in the sense that the whole foreign policy of Greece since 1844, through that famous Colletti speech, the Megali Idea, the great idea, everybody, Venizelos including, and the royals, of course, were in a way, I wouldn't say prisoners of that idea, but that was the idea that they wanted, you know, to somehow, to recreate Byzantium. And Smyrna, of course, as Giles said, was the city in the Ottoman Empire, which was the most important one, including with Constantinople. So in that sense, obviously the strategic elements and the geopolitical elements were secondary in the way. It was the fulfillment of the great idea.
No, the main reason why Greece went to Smyrna was the saving of Greeks from slaughter and extinction. Geopolitics and geostrategies came later in the course of this story. Greece, the only way to save those fellow Greeks was to place them under Greek sovereignty and under the aegis of the Greek army. There was no other way. Nobody else, no other power was there to protect them. So
your view
it's
was,
either take it or leave it.
Okay, so your view is the landing was inevitable, it had to happen, and the loss of Smyrna was not inevitable.
No.
Whether if the strategy was different and if the morale was different. But your view is slightly.
So I was just wanted to pick up on where you said recreate the Byzantine Empire. Of course, talking of Venizelos' sort of charm offensive in Paris, the Byzantine Empire, this held absolutely no interest whatsoever to British politicians. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George didn't care at all about the Byzantine Empire. So what Venizelos did was he said he wanted to recreate the empire of classical Greece. This he knew would strike a chord with all the classically educated politicians who'd gathered in Paris. And yeah, it was a smart move on his part.
Shall we open the debate to the floor? Would you like, actually, we said before we said that, we were going to read something.
Yeah, I just got two passages because I thought they're quite powerful testimonies. This is George Ward Price, who is writing a report, many reports from one of the battleships in the bay of Smyrna, and just he says he's standing on the deck, looking out towards the quayside where there are several 100,000 refugees at great danger of being burned by this inferno that's burning on the quayside. And he says Smyrna has been practically destroyed by a gigantic fire. Without exaggeration, tonight's Holocaust is one of the biggest fires in the world's history. He says the refugees are huddled on the narrow quay between the advancing fiery death behind and the deep water in front, and there comes such frantic screaming of sheer terror as can be heard miles away. Picture a constant projection into a red-hot sky of gigantic incandescent balloons burning oil spots in the Aegean, the air filled with nauseous smell, while parching clouds, cinders and sparks drift across it, and you can but have a glimmering of the scene of appalling and majestic destruction of which we are all watching. And it should be said they were watching, and the screaming from the quayside was so loud that the commander of the British battleships ordered his ship's bands to strike up music so they could drown out the noise of the screaming. And one last short extract. This is from the American consul George Horton, who was to become an important eyewitness of what happened. And Yanis mentioned it in his introduction. He's sailing out of the Bay of Smyrna on the battleship Simpson. And he says, as the destroyer moved away from the fearful scene and darkness descended, the flames, raging now over a vast area, grew brighter and brighter, presenting a scene of awful and sinister beauty. Nothing was lacking in the way of atrocity, lust, cruelty, and all the fury of human passion, which, given their full play, degrade the human race to the lower level than the vilest and cruelest of beasts. One of the keenest impressions which I brought away with me from Smyrna was a feeling of shame that I belonged to the human race.
Okay, and I want to finish this kind of presentation. When I was a student at Oxford, I was translating Ezra Pound. There was a journal called The Little Review that Pound edited. And in the spring of 1923, I was surprised to find in this journal a poem by Ernest Hemingway entitled They All Made Peace, What is Peace? Because Hemingway at the time was a journalist for the Toronto Star, the Canadian newspaper, and he actually went to Lausanne to see the workings after the catastrophe and the exchange of populations. So he wrote this very, I suppose, fun in a way, poem, in which, it's very short, I'll read it to you. He mentions some of the personalities that he met, like Lord Curzon, who was a British foreign minister, Kemal, of course, Mussolini. He mentions Venizelos as well. I'll just read it to you because it's interesting. First of all, in the opening of the poem, he mentions the Armenians, when at the time nobody was actually talking about the genocide of the Armenians. He also mentions Mussolini with capital letters in the poem in a very bad way, when a lot of people actually in Greece at the time admired Mussolini, including Kazantzakis, who thought he was a great man. So this is the poem. All the Turks are gentlemen, and Ismet Pasha is a little deaf. Ismet Pasha was the Inonu. He was the man who was there to negotiate the exchange of population, and apparently little deaf, what Hemingway means here is that he was wearing his hearing aid, and whenever the British were speaking, he was taking out, so he wouldn't listen to what the British were saying. So all the Turks are gentlemen, and Ismet Pasha is a little deaf. But the Armenians, how about the Armenians? Well, the Armenians. Lord Curzon liked young boys. So does Chicherin. So does Mustafa Kemal. He's good looking too. His eyes are too close together, but he makes war. This is the way he is. Lord Curzon doesn't love Chicherin, not at all. His beard trickles and his hands are cold. He thinks all the time. Lord Curzon thinks too, but he's much taller and goes to St. Moritz. Mr. Child does not wear a hat. Baron Hayashi gets in and out of the automobile. Monsieur Barrère gets telegrams, so does Marquis Garoni. His telegrams come on motorcycles from Mussolini. Mussolini has nigger eyes and a bodyguard and has his picture taken reading a book upside down. Mussolini is wonderful. Read the Daily Mail. I used to know Mussolini. Nobody liked him then. Even I didn't like him. He was a bad character. Ask Monsieur Barrère. Well, or drink cocktails. Is it too early to have a cocktail? How about a drink, George? Come on and we'll have a cocktail, Admiral. Just time before lunch. Well, what did we do? Not too dry. Well, what do you do boys know this morning? Oh, they're shrewd. They're shrewd. Mr. Stabulinsky walks up the hill and down the hill. Don't talk about Mr. Venizelos. He's wicked. You can see it. His beard shows it. Mr. Charlie is not wicked. Mrs. Charlie has flat breasts, and Mr. Charlie is an idealist and wrote Harding's campaign speeches and called Senator Beveridge Al. You know me, Al. Lincoln Stephens is with child. The big C makes the joke easy. Then there is Mosul and the Greek patriarch. What about the Greek patriarch? He mentioned some people there, diplomats and stuff like that. And then in the same journal, he wrote 6 short pieces Two actually are about Greece. One is about the refugees, which is very interesting, and one is about the execution of the six. So the execution of the six, he mentions Woonaris without giving the name, but it's very moving. And it's the following. He said, they shot the 6 cabinet ministers at 6:30 in the morning against the wall of the hospital. There were pools of water in the courtyard. There were wet dead leaves on the paving of the courtyard. It rained hard. All the shutters of the hospital were nailed shut. One of the ministers was sick with typhoid. 2 soldiers carried him downstairs and out into the rain. They tried to hold him up against the wall, but he sat down in a puddle of water. The other 5 stood very quietly against the wall. Finally, the officer told the soldiers it was not good trying to make him stand up. When they fired the first volley, he was sitting down in the water with his head on his knees. And this is Woonaris, the prime minister. And the other one, very short, it's about Andrianople. He says, minarets stuck up in the rain out of Andrianople across the mud floods. The carts were jammed for 30 miles along the Karagach road. Water buffalo and cattle were hauling carts through the mud. No end and no beginning, just carts loaded with everything they owned. The old men and women soaked through, walked along, keeping the cattle moving. The Maritsa, or Evros, was running yellow almost up to the bridge. Carts were jammed solid on the bridge with camels bobbing along with them. Greek cavalry headed along the procession. Women and kids were in the carts, crouched with mattresses, mirrors, swing machines, bundles. There was a woman having a kid, with a young girl holding a blanket over her, crying, scared, sick, looking at it. It rained all through the evacuation. So that's interesting because this is Hemingway, who was a young writer at the time. Of course, as we know, he became a novelist, he wasn't a poet. But it's an eyewitness account by an American, like you read your account, who actually happened to, to see the evacuation of the refugees and who actually went to Lausanne to see the proceedings.
And one thing just worth mentioning is that although he was not in Smyrna at the time, he obviously met a lot of people who had been in Smyrna, and that formed the basis of one of his early short stories called On the Quay of Smyrna.
Okay, thank you very much, Giles, and thank you, Professor Plumidis. So now we have short time for questions. Kostas Katsoularis, novelist and editor of Book Press, and a good friend of mine. Shall we give you a microphone? No? Okay, thank you.
I would like to ask, during those days of September, where was the Greek Navy?
Very good question.
I would like both.
Yeah, okay. A good question. The Greek Navy was offshore. There were many Greek ships, vessels off the shore, just outside the Bay of Smyrna, and they did not come to the rescue of the Greek refugees. And there's a most extraordinary story, one of the greatest, I think, humanitarian rescue efforts led by one man to come out of this whole episode. And this was a chap called Asa Jennings, who was worked for the YMCA in Smyrna. He'd achieved very little of note in his life, was a very unremarkable character, but he was appalled by the human suffering that he was witnessing on the quayside of Smyrna. And he tried to do something about it. No one would listen to him. So eventually he got word through to the Greek government. He said he was head of the American Relief Committee, and he wanted to requisition, essentially, the 20 Greek vessels that were outside the Bay of Smyrna. To his utter astonishment, the Greek government agreed to place him in charge of this fleet. And thus begun this rescue mission, led by this little chap from the YMCA. He brought in these vessels and saved, it's difficult to say how many people exactly, but certainly tens and tens of thousands of people were plucked from the quayside, put onto the Greek vessels, and sent to Mytilene and other places. So probably some, but I have hazy recollections that they did, but I think this was the major rescue effort because these are the big ships. It should also be said that by this point, the Allied battleships were also rescuing people not because the captains or commanders wanted it, but because the men on board were so appalled by what they were witnessing. This was happening only a few hundred meters away, that they also put down their little boats from the battleships and went to rescue people.
At the time of when Smyrna was being burned, there were about 20 Greek carriage ships around Mytilene, in that area. The Greek Navy, though, fear that if they landed in Turkey, the Turks, the Kemalist Turks, will seize the ships, and with them they will retake Mytilenean here. So instead of saving these people, Greece would have lost also the Aegean Islands.
And actually, just as an extra thing, that the Greek naval commander asked Admiral Mark Bristol, who was the US commander, will you protect our ships if we come into the Bay of Smyrna? And Mark Bristol, who again was under instructions from Washington, the Turks have won, he said, no, we won't. So that stopped the Greek Navy coming in.
Hi, Giles. A twofold question. First of all, was there a grand plan? In other words, okay, the Turkish army and irregulars enter the city, the Greek army is withdrawing. What were the Turks planning to do? Suppose there were no ships in the bay, nobody to rescue these people on the quay, right? What would have happened to these people? Was the plan to kill them? A. B. In recent days, recent weeks, months, President Erdogan keeps using the Smyrna catastrophe as a warning to Greeks today, right? Don't let this happen. Don't let us do this to you again. What is the resonance of this incident in the Turkish imagination? I mean, how do Turks view the disaster in Smyrna?
Taking the first issue, I think by the time the Turks have taken control of the city, I think Mustafa Kemal was, although many of the men were dragged off into the interior, there are numerous accounts of deportations and people being taken off into Anatolia. I think that actually, by the time the Allies started taking off the Greek population, Mustafa Kemal was very happy for this to take place because it simply emptied Smyrna of Greeks, which was, I think, one of his primary goals. In terms of Erdogan now, the language he's using at the moment is so inflammatory, it's quite extraordinary. I think, I don't know what to add to that. It's just extremely dangerous language. I mean, we see Putin doing it, he's coming straight out of the same playbook. You know, you're threatening nuclear weapons, you're making these comments.
No, I understand, but what I'm asking is this. In Turkish historiography, in Turkish imagination, how do the Turks view the disaster in Smyrna? In other words, when they hear Erdogan saying these things, they say, aha, yeah, let's do it again, or it's sort of an indifferent incident to them, generally speaking. Because to us, it's a very traumatic event. Is it, and very central to our modern history, is it so with the Turks?
Well, I think, you know, you have to view this through the prism of their approach, which is that either the Greeks or the Armenians burnt the city. So everything is seen from a totally different point of view. I don't know if you...
You know, in 1821, for example, in our history books, we say the liberation of Tripolitsa. In Turkish books, they say the slaughter of Tripolitsa. We say the slaughter of Chios. They say the liberation of Chios. So honestly, you know, for them, it's the, you know, taking hold of a city that, according to them, belongs to them. As Giles said, it was always Gaul Izmir, the infidels Izmir. So now it's in the hands of the right people. I mean, you know, probably that doesn't mean that they actually, all the Turks, abide by the, you know, warmongering of Erdogan and they agree with his rhetoric. But obviously, for them, it's a victory. Yeah. You know, what do you think about it?
As one of my ancestors, Manousos Plumidis, was a renowned journalist. He worked for Tmήμα and other newspapers. Had pointed out in one of his books is that New Turkey, meaning Turkey as a nation state, has never experienced a national disaster. Whereas Greece experienced a national disaster in 1922. It was defeated by Germany in 1941 and again in Cyprus in 1974. Turkey has not experienced it. So that's why it's raging now and it's in a nationalist hysteria. But if you allow me to make a further comment, the rule in history, that's what Hobsbawm points out, for the nation states is not Großstadt, it's Kleinstaaterei. All nation states follow this rule. meaning nation states cannot be as large as empires. So if you want to be a nation state, forget about empires. Turkey doesn't understand this.
Maybe does put it. Any other question? Yes.
I have a question
okay.
for
Okay.
all of
No,
you.
I can listen. Yeah.
Okay. What would be the fate of Smyrna if King Alexander didn't die?
Alexander.
Yes.
That's 333 BC. That's about it's about 2,000 years before that. It's like saying what would have happened if the Ostrogoths didn't actually, the Vandals attack Rome. I don't know. Would be probably under the Roman Empire.
The monkey beaten. The prince.
Prince.
Yes.
With a monkey bite.
Yes. He gave also his
sorry,
name
sorry,
to
sorry.
Alexandropolis.
Yeah, sorry. I thought Alexander the Great.
No.
Oh, okay.
So,
You have this twist of providence that changes history. I mean, it's a bizarre episode. But I think that, even if he hadn't died, as Professor Plumidis said, the royals wanted the king back anyway.
In my humble opinion, the same would have happened exactly as we know. The story would have been the same. I think that the anti-Venizalists would have raised the dynastic issue all the same, meaning that they would have demanded before and especially after the elections the return of King Constantine to the throne and the abdication of his second son, Alexander, in favor of his father.
Anyway, the king did something very clever. When he left Greece, he didn't ask his first son to be take his position, but his second son, implying that he would come back. He didn't actually appoint the heir, which was his son, but his second son, meaning that this was a temporary arrangement. It wasn't a permanent arrangement. Sometimes you have this kind of fortunate events or unfortunate events that act like catalysts in history.
What ifs are tormenting them. Yeah.
Okay, yes?
The events of Smyrna and the Asia Minor catastrophe outside of Greece are seem to be practically unknown. In 1940, Henry Miller wrote in the Colossus of Marusi that the events of Smyrna have been soft-pedaled and practically expunged from the memory of present-day man. And that was just 18 years after the events. Today, when I first came to Greece years ago, I'd never heard of anything about Smyrna or the Asia Minor catastrophe. Why do you think, I don't know, whoever would like to answer, why do you think these events are just so not known outside of Greece?
One thing I noticed when my book came out in America, I went on a book tour to, sort of promotional tour, and I went to some unusual places where you would never normally go on a book tour, and one of them was Ohio, because Ohio has a number of communities of families who are descended from those who fled from Smyrna in 1922. And what was astonishing, talking to them afterwards and the questions they raised, is that they knew absolutely nothing whatsoever about their family history, literally nothing. And this is because when their grandparents, their great-grandparents fled the city, it was so painful what they went through, and they lost everything, and often lost members of their families as well, that they refused ever to talk about it. So it was almost, there's this sort of collective amnesia, and they were fascinated to begin to learn about their own family stories and what had happened. Also, I think the other reason is that no one in this event comes out of it particularly well. Neither the Greeks, the Turks, the British, the Americans, and so that perhaps is another reason why it hasn't been widely written about.
Can I say something else though? I mean, whether you say that we commemorate events and how many Greeks actually know about that. My grandmother was from Smyrna, and when she arrived in Greece, she married my grandfather, who was Athenian. She was astounded to find out that how bad was the Greek cuisine. They ate just steaks. And then she said, where are the sauces? I mean, So this culture of Smyrna is still with us, on the food, on the music. I mean, we do a lot of things that have to do with that kind of culture that came from Smyrna to Greece. So, I mean, you know, perhaps young people don't know about the history and what exactly happened, but, you know, we know that at some point the coffee we used to drink, which was called Turkish, became Greek coffee. And we know that the rebetika, for example, the music that we, you know, came from this cafe man from Anatolia. And so there's a lot of traditions that are part of modern Greek life. Although, you know, things are changing, and now you go to islands and people are somehow embarrassed to have a Greek salad. So this summer when I was in Tinos, I found in a restaurant that they said salad with feta foam and Parmigiana flakes. So we're using now a kind of nouveau cuisine, and we're afraid to say that the salad has just feta. We have to use a foam of feta. But I think, you know, that things survive. Still a lot of stuff from that kind of culture survives.
Oh, yes, traditions here. Greece wouldn't be Greece the way it is without the refugees having come from Smyrna. You know, I meant outside of outside of Greece.
I forgot the neighborhoods. You know, I mean, we spoke about 2 days ago. I don't know if there's any IKGs here. Ike is a team here. We had a new. Somebody said we had a new. Not me. I'm not Ike, but they had a new stadium. The stadium was in Nea Philadelphia. Okay, and in fact, it's very funny. I saw on television the news about this new stadium. You know who actually spoke on the news? The patriarch, Bartholomeos, said about the stadium that because Ike is, you know, from Constantinople. Can you imagine an English football team where the, you know, or an Italian where the Vatican, the Pope would actually speak about an Italian team? But in Greece, we had the patriarch actually giving his blessing, and also there was a priest in the field giving his blessing.
Yeah.
So, you know, and you have all these neighborhoods, you know, Nea Smyrna, Nea Philadelphia, Nea Erythrea, all, I mean, it's there. And there's the embarrassing also picture going down Alexandra Street with the refugee buildings opposite the Panathenαϊκό Stadium, which is a droppy, which is, a, you know, it's a huge embarrassment to actually have them. But again, it's a memory of the refugees.
May I answer this question? No, I'm a Panathinaikos supporter. I would like to answer this question, why Asia Minor and Smyrna and Greece is not in the news much this year. I happened to be in England this summer, in August, visiting in-laws, and I skipped through the pages of History Today magazine, really undoubtedly serious popular history magazine that I used to read when I was a student, an MA student there. And the event that was commemorated through its pages was the Battle of Stalingrad, the 60 years anniversary from the Battle of Stalingrad that started 80 years ago in November 1942. So I think that the answer to this issue is what Arnold Toynbee is teaching us, that Greece and Turkey are important to the West so long as the Eastern question is a Western question, meaning whether they have vested and serious interests there.
That a lot of episodes in national histories, they don't take the front page. I mean, there are a lot of wars between different countries, and we're not aware of them. Even the Greeks are not aware of all the wars that happen, and what we have hundreds of commemorations. I mean, how many of you actually, you know, lost their sleep because there was a 200 years for the liberation and the creation of Brazil? I happen to have a half-brother and half-sister in Brazil. For them, it was a huge event. Who actually in Greece did we lost our sleep because Brazil was celebrating 200 years of independence? No, from King Pedro. So, you know, that's okay. We lose things. We are not aware of everything. Any other question? Sudan.
This is a question for Giles. Would you consider the Asia Minor catastrophe and the exchange of populations in 1922 as the first documented ethnic engineering exchange of populations? Would that be the first known?
As in terms of documented, possibly. But I was reading about this just the other day, and I think it is certainly the one where there is a wealth of documentation about what happened, and of course it set a precedent, eagerly followed by Stalin and others, and right through the 20th century. But yeah, I think it probably is. Oh, correct me, please.
This was during the Greek Revolution, when there was this exchange where the citizens of Parga had to leave Parga because Parga was given to Ali Pasha, and they had to cross and go to Corfu and the Ionian Islands, and that's also documented. So we can go further back, where cities were evacuated.
But this was an exchange purely on the basis of ethnicity
It wasn't an exchange.
and
It was
religion.
that Pargan people
probably.
had to evacuate. It was a ghost city afterwards. It was given to Ali Pasha. It was like a ghost city. So all the people had actually to evacuate on a Good Friday of that year. So yeah, you can go back. Mind the Parga thing. Are you tired of us? You're not yet. Okay. One more question. I think we'll probably give it a close after that. One last one.
My question is this: in all the sequence of events and mistakes and circumstances that led to the Asia Minor catastrophe, do you single out one which you think was really critical? Like it was more.
What was the most critical mistake that was made in the sequence of events? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah.
There are so many. Where to begin? I mean, one starting point which we already talked about is the landing of the Greek army and the fashion in which it was carried out.
Yeah, but Professor Plumidis said it had to happen to protect the Greek population, so it wasn't a mistake. It had to happen. So what is the mistake?
A war is a war. I mean, you have victims, so this were going to happen later, sooner or later. And we should put a framework of the burning of Smyrna, of other war atrocities committed by the Greek army. There were other 3 cities, at least, that were burned by the Greek army in 1921. Is Nik first, Nicomedia, and secondly, Cutahia and Manisa, Magnesia, in the summer of 1922. So war produces atrocities, war produces violence, and the violence didn't start in 1922. It started in 1914. We should not forget that.
So what is the mistake, if we answer that question? Your major mistake that led to the catastrophe, if we can identify?
Mismanagement, political, diplomatic mismanagement, military mismanagement.
But that's the case as well for the landing of the Greek army. I mean, war is war, but the manner in which it was carried out, with the Archbishop, the Metropolitan blessing the troops, with the bands landing, it was mismanagement on a massive scale.
Yeah, it was a provocation. It could have been avoided. Yes. But there was no other way to save these people from extinction, unless you land an army there. It was Greece's last chance. And as I said earlier, what happened in Smyrna in 1922 will have happened all the same back in 1914. The reason why Smyrna was saved in 1914 because 3 powers, Greece, okay, also, but 3 powers, mainly Russia, Britain, and France, intervened diplomatically and demanded from the Turkish government the stop to put a stop to these violent events, to this pogrom. And also Russia sent a warship there, a small military vessel, to the Bay of Smyrna to make its point stronger.
Okay. Last question? No, there's Vivian is coming, please.
I was thinking about it. Hi everyone, going a bit to the storytelling aspect in the book. And I have a 6-year-old kid, just entered the Greek schooling sector, no doubt very soon they're going to be learning about these events. What is the message you're going to leave to the generations about what happened in that event? And I'm coming from Australia. I spent years there, and they celebrate and commemorate the Gallipoli battle where there was slaughter, and they turn it into a message of mateship and friendship between the nations. How shall we say the story of this event?
Well, it's true that every nation puts its colour on political events, and so, you know, in my own particular country, Dunkirk is seen as this great victory, which is a slightly odd way of looking at the desperate, rush to get British troops back to Britain. from almost certain defeat, humiliating defeat. So I don't know, the thing that sort of attracted me to this story when I was really looking into the cosmopolitan makeup of Smyrna was how close it was to our modern cities that we live in, you know, my own city of London, just the diversity, the multi-ethnic makeup of these cities, and how easy and how fast it is for these societies to unravel. And I think that was one of the things that was I was taking with me all the way through it, that these they created something fragile was created in Smyrna, and it was smashed very easily.
It seems to me that there's a conflict between, you know, the building of a nation on the one hand and multinationalism, which is Smyrna, and the two can't at the kind of the moment of history they can't coincide. The people who actually try to build a nation, they're not, you know, they're not going to accept that kind of cosmopolitan spirit that Giles was describing about Smyrna. There's a conflict there that it's inevitable, and nation building somehow doesn't give space to this kind of openness and multiculturalism. Okay, thank you so much, all of you, Professor Plumidis, Giles Mίλτον, Publishing House here, and the professors, Claudia Caridis here, deans, and the people here. Thank you so much. And our author here, who didn't actually want to ask a question, so you were, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.